Welcome to Professor Gerhard Schmitt. Gerhard, so happy having you here while you woke up. So Professor Schmitt is known as a globally renowned educator and innovator. He inspires peoples and minds around the world. That ranges from students that join him in the classrooms at Harvard University, all the way to international audiences at TED events like the TEDx of the Technical University of Munich. Gerhard, you have received the European Culture of Science Award for your ETH Zurich Science City, where you developed your first zero-emission campus. We are really honored to have you here and look forward to what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Morten. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy and thankful to be here. I was especially impressed by the tour through the building and also through the equipment that we saw. I think that's a huge step forward into the future. I want to give you a quick vision of a regenerative future city. I think we have to go far beyond sustainability because there's almost no sustainable city in the world today. So we have to think about the next and the next step. Let me start with the first image. This is by accident. I had no idea that this would be about forest, this building here, when I made the presentation. But we think that the future city, the regenerative future city, has to have very many things in common with a forest, of course, above ground and below ground, because the forests are truly able to regenerate themselves and also do more than just sustain themselves. I want to start with the credits, and this is also one part of our job. Our business is education and research, and of course the people who are supporting this research are the ones that we have to be thankful, and they also contribute a lot to the future, especially the young people that you see in here. Students and PhD researchers from all parts of the world, they are the ones who will be the important part of the regeneration, because these people all will have new jobs in the future, jobs and professions that don't even exist right now. And we are relying on them and on you to train the future generations with these new technologies that we invent. So the vision is simple. We look for responsive and regenerative future cities. We know that cities are not only the causes, but also the victims of climate change. We have to look beyond smart cities. We have to look towards responsive cities. We have to go beyond sustainable cities. We have to go towards regenerative cities. And most of all, we have to go with business and with society into responsive and regenerative enterprises. This is where we work. One part is in Zurich at the ETH, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, and here in Singapore, where we founded the so-called Singapore-ETH Center 10 years ago. And I want to start with a big picture. There are more than 2 billion more people who live in cities, who will live in cities in the next 30 years. So that's a huge task. And I think it's very good that we are here in those places where the problem really evolves. The problem of hot temperatures, the problem of humidity, and most of the people who move into these cities and who will live in the cities will not be living in Europe or United States, but they will be in Africa and in Asia. Just to show you two images, this is 1950, and you can see the world has big centers, of course, Japan and Tokyo are very densely populated, China and India already as well, United States, East Coast mostly. But if you compare that to looking forward maybe 6, 7, 8 years in 2030, and you can see how it has completely changed. And if it continues like that, that means the urbanization is proceeding at the state it is proceeding now. That means very slow urbanization, relatively slow urbanization. At the end of the century, we have more people on the African continent than in all of Asia. These are the predictions. And all of this, of course, requires technological solutions and, as the speakers before said, also societal solutions. So the governance of the future city is as important as the technology of the future city and the skills and the knowledge of the new students. Let me get to some specific points. I said cities are at the same time causes and victims of climate change. And this company here, coming from Sweden, also a beautiful country. I come from Switzerland at the moment, and we can say it's a luxury climate in Switzerland because these countries sometimes even benefit from climate change in certain degrees, except for the people who are building ski lifts and so on. But otherwise, these lakes that you see here, they are huge batteries, they are storage lakes, and there's a lot of things people can do with the energy they have. They have no oil, they have no gas, nothing of this, but they have lakes. And the energy mix of countries like Switzerland and Sweden, we discussed this a little bit before, is very diversified. You can see it's a lot of input on the left side, energy sources, crude oil, petroleum, natural gas, and at the bottom the green nuclear power and blue water. And on the right side is where this energy is used. If you go to another country or part of the world, another city, Singapore, completely different climate. And Singapore is at the same time, of course, cause and very strongly also victim of climate change because every single person in that country, in that city, feels it. And they have to do something against it. And for them, the solution seems to be pretty clear because if you look at the same diagram as for Switzerland before, we see the input on the left side is purely oil and gas. And with that, Singapore has to produce the electricity, this little blue part here, which Switzerland can do with water, or Sweden can also do with water. So this is a very strong case for decarbonization, and that also shows us that every city, every country has a different DNA and different demands for coming to a responsive or regenerative solution. We have to go beyond smart cities, we have to move towards responsive cities. What does it mean? Everybody today is calling their city a smart city, and many, many different technologies are entered into the city, from smart parking to smart mobility and so on. But this is, or has been, at least in the beginning, a very much technology-driven event, and the people took a long time to catch on, and it was often not made directly for the people, it was more for running the city. By now, many cities have recognized that, many citizens, and they demand that they are involved in the further development of the smart city. And that leads us to the responsive city. In the responsive city, the individual person or groups of persons, they are really the ones who are in charge. They say what they need, what they want. They use smart city technology, of course, but they are part of managing the city, part of designing the city, and so on. This is the system we have in Switzerland, where we have a very, very strong bottom-up direct democracy. Let's look at the development. There's very strong examples for smart cities, even smart nations like Singapore with the pavilion just across the street here. And Singapore is introducing this technology to a very deep level, every part of city management. And at the same time, people are involved very nicely in celebrating Independence Day. So it's not huge military parades, but it's also people being in the city and enjoying it. Another move from smart cities towards responsive city, we can say, for example, in Zurich, where the people bottom up demand everything that has to be done in the city, and the politicians more or less then have to fulfill that. Or another city, which is the #1 actually in livability in the world, Vienna, where there's also a very strong civic engagement in all of this. So we think this is important because people who are in city, they know best what is needed. They know the temperature, they know what's good, what is not working, and so on. So if they have these gadgets and they can supply the information and data, technology companies like yours and the ones you are representing can work much better. Sustainable cities, we think, are not enough because so far they are very, very few. It's getting worse and worse. The cities are, of course, 60 to 70% of the emissions and the greenhouse gases and all of this. So we have to do something, not only to keep it stable, but to give back. And the slide we saw at the beginning from this building, where a lot of the CO2 is actually embodied in the basement to the top of the building, is a very good example where we have to go. We can do that with different aspects. It's not just energy, but it's also water. It's basically all the stocks and flows of a city that happen there. Water is a very important one. And in Singapore, for example, the reservoirs in the center of the city, they're at the same time a recreation area, but also to store the water and also to dampen the temperature, as we will see in a bit. One example from Switzerland, the Monte Rosa hut, almost at 3,000 meter high. That was many years ago, our Formula One experiment to see how much autonomy we could give a building at such a height. And also, like here, it's made almost entirely of wood, because wood is fantastic material. It's lightweight to transport to these areas and so on. So these are steps towards sustainability. After 13 years of this hut that you saw, electricity production in the summer is totally given, and consumption of water from melting water as well. In winter, of course, it's totally submerged in snow. But even for very big parts of cities, the science city that was mentioned before, we took all the buildings and put them together into a network, and the excess of rejected heat in the summer, because of these are huge, the blue one, research buildings produce a lot of heat, was dumped into the ground. We have a dynamic earth storage system there that takes it out in winter, and this way uses the energy from the summer for the winter. In this building, it's also towards sustainability, not regenerative purposes yet. The production of photovoltaic electricity is, of course, very great. The heating with the dynamic earth storage is very great, and the CO2 reduction is very massive through this reduction of the heating demands. But let's not forget also what supplies the cities with food. Agriculture, for example. Here we have a big change towards biogas, towards electric use on the stables of that. This building I built with my brother-in-law, and here after 7 years the production photovoltaic and biogas is very, very big. The food, the sustainable milk production, milking robots and so on has increased, and most importantly, reduction of methane is also very strong. Or a house in Germany just finished, almost like this house, towards regenerative use. After 11 months you can see the production of electricity is almost 3 times as large as the consumption. The regenerative aspects of these houses that we should use are, of course, that we have to not only recycle, but we have to reuse, and we can use different materials in these houses. And we have a complete example in Switzerland. This part of the building was entirely made of only reused, and people who come to these buildings, they always want to be there because they find it the coolest. Maybe part of this building will be reused in this way as well. So responsive and regenerative enterprises, there have to be people who know this, who transport that to the next generation, and therefore we need to educate them. We have made one example. Nothing that you see or have seen is far in the future. It's actually happening now. Cooling Singapore is one of these projects. We involve people in the decision what should be changed in the city. These are Singaporean people who vote and propose the green streets or green energy and so on. They also propose where to put the tax money to do that. And they are very, very distinct about this. They don't say just make everything green, but they go down into the details. They even say where in the city that should be done. So this collaboration between the population, who is very, very involved in these things, who is very smart and using all smart technology from their smart cities, is most important. And with that then, in Singapore, the government is planning to move this entire harbor that many of you probably have seen 10 kilometers to the west, and that means all of this land then becomes free to be reused for commercial and for recreational and for living. And the people are directly involved through making proposals for that. Cooling cities in a regenerative way is important. We have to go to the sources of the heat. We cannot say, okay, we put in air conditioning because that doesn't work everywhere and is not possible in many places when you have this huge humidity and you do not have enough capital to do that. So we have to go and try to figure out what can be done. I just give you some mitigation measures so that you see the problem has many dimensions. It's, for example, it's the urban geometry. And beyond each one of these pictures now will pop up a whole bunch of mitigation measures we can do in order to, for a tropical climate like Singapore, to mitigate the heat better. Or it's vegetation, or it's water bodies, and also the shading attached to that. It is also the materials and surfaces, like here in this building, you can see it quite well. It's the transportation modes that have to be changed, and of course, it's the energy supplied. This is the example that you saw before from the top. One of the few, not so few, but still not many buildings that use centralized air conditioning in Singapore, our building. And here we can see quite well what we do. We make simulations. We develop what-if scenarios to define the best cooling options. We go from reality that we see here, from the real world. We build digital twins. Then we go to scenarios, district cooling, solar panels, electric vehicles, combinations of that, combinations of all these different options you saw before. And then in the end, we arrive at a scenario that might be good for city planning. It's not easy. You cannot just turn the thermostat down for a whole city. You have to consider all these things, impact on the environment, on the economy, on the health, on the costs. So if you do, as a city governance, turn down the thermostat, you have to consider all these things: materials, energy, vegetation, shading, transport, urban geometry, and water features. And they're all interlinked. And because they are interlinked, we have to build this very large, what we call digital urban climate twins, where we have a federation of models. The beautiful visualizations we saw before are the one very important product with which we can then show what the impact of the individual models and measurements would be for the future city. And in the end, then you can see how the city behaves. Here it's at 2 o'clock, this is Singapore, 3 o'clock in the morning. You see the urban heat islands that have developed. 5 o'clock in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, people start to drive to work with their cars. This is the emissions of the heat emissions from the cars into the urban system. Then 10, 11 o'clock, there's a breeze coming from the sea. It cools it down a little bit to just 28 degrees. But at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it heats up again, and 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, people drive home, gets more heat into the urban system, and then finally at night, even at night, the heat that is gone into the buildings cannot escape. It comes out, radiates out, and makes it very uncomfortable to sleep. This is a problem that many, many, many cities have, and it's fantastic that you have some of the solutions to solve that. Let me come to the end. The conclusion is, from the vision of regenerative future cities, it's a few steps. We have to go through responsive governance to empower the people to support this development, and we have to go towards regenerative enterprises. There are new jobs in nature-based cooling and heating, new jobs in reuse and recycling, and new jobs in private-public industry partnerships. And I hope some of this, and I'm sure some of this we'll hear about more afterwards. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Schmitt. Once again, that was a truly inspirational speech, and it's impressive to see how you and your students envision the future of responsive cities, and also to see the examples from Singapore. Incredible.